U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War relied heavily on helicopters as a means of transport and logistics, as well as close air support. While helicopters had seen service in Korea, mostly as medevac and utility vehicles, they were essentially untested in actual combat roles. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, affectionately known as the Huey, had served with distinction throughout the Vietnam War in medevac, logistics, and combat roles, but was starting to show its age by the late 60s. The U.S. Air Force began drafting requirements for a replacement helicopter and named the program the Utility Tactical Transport Aircraft System. The UTTAS requirements basically boiled down to be the Huey but better, increase the survivability of the crew, increase durability of the aircraft, be easily transportable, and perform in hot and high conditions where the air is significantly less dense due to altitude and temperature. I wonder why they wanted that. As well, the aircraft was required to fit a pair of General Electric T700 engines, which were being developed concurrently with the UTTAS project. Boeing Vertol, Bell Helicopters, and Sikorsky all placed bids for the project, with Sikorsky's S-70 prototype snagging the win. Now christened the UH-60 Black Hawk, it first saw combat with the U.S. Army when in 1983, America attempted to liberate the Caribbean island of Grenada during Operation Urgent Fury. The Marines had not yet adopted the helicopter, since there were suddenly so many more available Hueys, so it was mercifully spared from appearing in one of the worst Clint Eastwood films ever made. Since then, the Black Hawk has been a staple of the U.S. military all over the globe, in no small part because of its modular nature. The UH-60 has an entire alphabet of models, allowing the user to configure a single helicopter to fit a myriad of missions. The model on the table today is the HobbyBoss 172nd UH-60A Blackhawk, or, excuse me, Lackhawk. HobbyBoss is the Epiphone to Trumpeter's Gibson. While most HobbyBoss models are well engineered and detailed very well, their smaller scale kits remain only kinda detailed. Nonetheless, this should be a quick and fun build. Let's get started. As with all aircraft kits, we begin with the interior. The floor plate is nearly half the size of the airframe, but all of the floor space is taken up by 12 seats for infantry, plus 2 for the crew and 2 for the pilots. Blackhawk seating is super modular, allowing the end user to configure the helo to whatever best fits the mission. It can be fitted with up to 6 stretchers for a medevac chopper, or with a posh interior for VIPs. The kit does not provide these options. Anyway, the legs that attach to the underside of the seats are pretty finicky and require a bit of work to get into their proper position. The final assemblies look alright, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. Moving forward, we have the roomest area in the helicopter, the cockpit. Now, I know this is only 1/72nd scale, and I know that the way everything is tucked into the nose that nothing is going to be seen, but I'm still just a little disappointed that none of the panels have detail. There's not even a provided decal for them. The instrument panels are supposed to look like this hot mess that I won't even pretend to be able to understand, but I guess flat black will do. The manual calls for the crew area to have a trio of seats, but we've already got too many seats in total, so I fill the center spot with putty and sand it back. With the door seats glued in place, the interior is all done and ready to be primed. Like most aircraft kits, the fuselage is molded in 2 halves, the port and the starboard. The UH-60 is basically symmetrical, so there aren't any major differences between the two. Just behind the pilot's door is what I thought was a grab handle, but is actually a homing antenna, and using it as a grab handle will severely screw it up. Don't do it. The landing gear is pretty simple, with the lower drag arm providing a sturdy linkage to the airframe and the upper arm containing the shock absorbers. In order to add some visual weight to the helicopter, it's necessary to flatten the wheels a little bit. I threw a steel washer in the toaster oven for a bit and then pressed the wheels against that. Unfortunately, most of the work was done off camera, but I did smooth out the deformation with some sandpaper afterwards. On the port side flank is a spindly little high-frequency antenna. In several US Army photos, you can see that the antenna isn't as long as the example were provided. It is the same length, however, as the antenna on these Japanese search and rescue Blackhawks. The part off the sprue is much sturdier than it looks, but as a result is thicker than it should be. With the arms cemented in place, I snipped the antenna off so I can replace it with the length of guitar string later. We're supposed to have a shaft dispenser here, but it's conspicuously missing. Just behind our missing shaft dispenser is what I assumed was a tiny little winglet, but is actually another antenna. The whole front surface of the tail boom? VHF antenna. This dingus hanging off the bottom? IFF antenna. The one just behind that? TACAN antenna. This guy canted off from the starboard engine? Aha! I gotcha! It's a rescue hoist. 2 of these guys are included, presumably one for port and for starboard, but all my reference photos that include a rescue hoist only have it mounted on the starboard side. These gigantic lozenges are external fuel tanks, and they each hold 230 gallons of fuel. Blackhawks built for normal operations have their tanks mounted on wings perpendicular to the fuselage, but birds built for search and rescue have the wings canted up and out of the crew's sightline. The 2 pins that attach the tanks to the wings don't fit very well because I didn't pay attention and put them on the wrong sides. The 2 prongs just ahead are the pitot tubes, which are used to measure airspeed. These are a good inclusion, but we're missing the pair of wire cutters standard to military Blackhawks. The main rotor is 4-bladed and 53 feet 8 inches in diameter. Each blade is built from a titanium spar for strength and wrapped in fiberglass for shape. Helicopters use ingenious yet bizarre engineering to fly the way that they do, and as a result the main rotor is a nauseatingly complex mass of metal. The main hub is a gigantic piece of titanium chosen for its incredible strength while still being very lightweight. The circular base of the assembly is the swash plate, which controls the pitch of the rotor blades through the pitch control rods. The cross sitting atop the main hub is an assembly of 4 vibration absorbers which work to prevent the rotor vibrating itself apart. Further back is the tail rotor, which is 11 feet in diameter, with each blade made of graphite and fiberglass. Its main duty, like on all helicopters with a tail rotor, is to provide counter torque and prevent the aircraft from frantically spiraling away. Physics is great. I love physics. It's difficult to notice in profile, but from the front or rear you can clearly see it's canted off 20 degrees from vertical. This is so that the rotor provides a downward thrust component in addition to its main lateral thrust, essentially giving the main rotor a helping hand. It's powered by a very intricate system of linkages and gearboxes attached to the main drive shaft. This triangular shape is both passive cooling and service access for the intermediate gearbox at the base of the tail boom. All the major sub-assemblies were primed earlier with Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch Gray. The interior was pre-shaded with black from Vallejo out of my master airbrush. I normally don't spray Vallejo through this airbrush, but I was feeling a little saucy and decided to try something different. It went on okay. I think in the future I'll stick to my Pasha H for Vallejo. I grab a non-airbrush brush and paint the control panels with the same black. When brush painting, it's best to build up multiple thin layers instead of slopping on all the paint at once. The control panel and some of the outer surfaces are painted flat black so that any glare reflecting off the metal surfaces doesn't blind the pilots. The seats are painted with a 4-to-1 mix of neutral gray and American olive drab, which was then lightened with a drop of white to paint some highlights. Once dry, I spray it all with Vallejo flat varnish and very lightly weather it with Vallejo Metal Colors aluminum. This could have gone a lot better. This paint is very thin straight out of the bottle and it wanted to run all over the place. As well, my fingers transferred paint where it didn't need to be, and my attempt to chip the area between the pilots and doorman came out horribly. Luckily, I checked and this area is almost invisible from outside the aircraft. With the interior all painted, we can finally seal it within the 2 halves of the fuselage. The ceiling is cantilevered off into the rhubarb, so I use a ratcheting clamp to lightly keep it in place while the glue dries. Once it is dry, I can snap it into the starboard side fuselage half and cement around the edges. I did some test fitting and found the halves a little tough to keep together, so I grabbed some old school tester's cement so I can have much more working time. I used the same ratcheting clamp to lightly keep the nose in place and then used thin wire wrapped around the fuselage to keep the halves together. I can then go along the seam with the usual Tamiya extra thin. Once dry and unwrapped, the seam is really gruesome. I'll readily admit to botching a few of the earlier steps, but I'm not taking the blame on this one. I spent a lot of time going back and forth by applying Tamiya putty and wet sanding with sanding sponges. After 3 layers of putty, I can add the oil cooler exhaust, of which there are a few different versions. This Austrian Blackhawk exhibits the version we have on the table. This US Army bird has the same base but with the ALQ-144 infrared jammer fixed. And these Japanese search and rescue hawks have a very flat and simple example. The mounting tab for the piece is a very tight fit, so I file the edges down. As well, the rear starboard corner is marred by an ejector pin mark, so I fill this in with dissolved plastic. The fairing sitting atop the crew compartment covers the fore end of the engine, as well as a huge bank of electronics and the powered accessories. There's a nearly imperceptible circle on the starboard side of the fairing, and this is the air intake for the cabin heating system. This hole is also present on the port side, but this is incorrect, so I fill it in with dissolved plastic as well. The nose has 2 protuberances that are native to Japanese search and rescue hawks. The larger one in the center is a radar bank, and the one canted to the port side is a turret equipped with a FLIR infrared camera. Unfortunately, this is where I'll have to leave things for a while. I lost a few of the parts necessary to finishing the bird, so I've reached out to Trumpeter for replacements. As well, I've got some custom decals on order that I'm really excited for. The kit itself wasn't bad, I've certainly had worse. The fit of the fuselage halves isn't perfect, and there are some strange omissions for a US Army Black Hawk. I'm willing to bet this was originally designed to be a search and rescue Hawk, rebranded with new decals to make it a standard US Army bird. Anyway, that's all for now. Hopefully I'll have the conclusion for you guys soon.